So Sam, thank you for those kind words, that introduction that you did. I remember a few weeks ago when Enzo showed me what he was intending to say as part of my bio, I couldn't help but feel like I was reading one of the best obituaries I've ever read. And so thank you for that. Almost everyone here, as Dom pointed out earlier today, we start off with a question. I'm sure everyone here has a story talking about their faith and how they've come to acknowledge the presence of Jesus and God in their lives. And it's a rhetorical question, because if I start doing and asking everyone to share their story, we'd be here even longer than my speech. So what I'd like to do is just to sort of tickle your ears and tell you my story, in the hope that it'll maybe give more meaning to the stories that you may also have, and be encouraged to share and be inspired by it. Again, as Dom pointed out, we are both Toastmasters. So according to a study conducted by Dr. Brian Ray of the National Home Education Research Institute and published in the Christian Post article dated March 11, 2016, 75 to 80% of public school children from Christian homes abandon their faith as adults. However, less than 10% of homeschool children leave their faith as adults. Clearly, how we educate our children makes a difference during one of the toughest times of our boys' lives, in this particular case with the Squires, developing into manhood from puberty through adolescence. And perhaps my story will provide some of you with an anchor when you will face the storms of doubt, because it will happen, and as sure as I'm standing here in front of you tonight. So let me share my truth as I lived between Wednesday, March 9th, 2022, to March 20th, 2022, 11 days. I'll never forget the evening on Wednesday, March 9th at approximately 6:15 p.m. because that evening my lifestyle as a middle-aged retiree became very complicated. And while I was relaxing on the sofa living room and watching TV, I began suffering from pain in my chest, and I debated with myself as to whether I should try to go to bed and sleep it off. And instead I stayed up and I took my blood pressure readings every 10 minutes to see if there was a trend. And sure enough, as time passed by, my blood pressure and heart rate got worse. And by 5 to 7, my blood pressure was now at 203 over 118 with a heart rate of 106. I'd always had a history of high blood pressure from my days serving in the military, but I was taking medication for it, and my family doctor and I thought we had it under control. I had been playing hockey at least twice a week, and I walked our dogs daily, but these chest pains and measurements were off the charts even for me. Now, since I had never experienced a heart attack before, I didn't know what I was experiencing, but I knew enough that it was not normal. So I phoned my daughter-in-law, who also happened to be a nurse at the emergency ward of the Children's Hospital for Eastern Ontario, CHEO. And she told me to phone for an ambulance immediately, which I did at 6:59. Current data suggests that 68.5% of all cardiac arrests happen in the home. And on average, EMS teams take between 6 to 12 minutes to arrive on the scene. And after 10 minutes, very few cardiac arrest victims survive. And in my case, the paramedics arrived in about 6 minutes. 2 of them set up their equipment, while another one had me chew 4 daily aspirin, followed by a spray of liquid nitro under my tongue. And they tried to insert an IV but missed, and given my high blood pressure, blood started to squirt everywhere. And as my wife later described when she came back, because I was no longer in the house, she said it looked like a crime scene. There was blood all over the carpet and gauze and the tourniquet all over the place. They eventually inserted the IV, and the 2 Labrador retrievers, who were tended to fetch everything because they're retrievers, were just kind of awestruck by what was going on, and they just sat there looking confused, if you know what a confused dog looks like. Meanwhile, I was telling the paramedics that my wife would be home in an hour and somebody had to wipe the bloodstains off the couch and the carpet. Eventually, one of them succeeded in placing the IV, while the other paramedics was busy trying to clean away the bloodstains on the carpet. And once the IV had been inserted, I was given some more morphine, but nothing seemed to be working. Then came the readout from the ECG showing that my heartbeat was normal. No signs of a heart attack. The paramedic explained that since he could not identify the problem, that I should go to the hospital and schedule an angiogram. So I asked if I should drive to the hospital myself, since the ECG was normal, and he replied that his crew had already medicated me. I had the 4 aspirins, the morphine, the nitro. So he said that the ambulance was already there as well, so they would take me. So we slowly got dressed, and as I walked outside, along the walkway toward the ambulance, I began losing my balance and collapsed into a fetal position on the gurney, crying in pain in my chest. When the paramedics dropped me off at the Queensway Carleton Hospital, they told me how lucky I was that I'd already received the morphine, the nitro, and the aspirin tablets just before the actual attack. I used the 4-leaf clover because this was around St. Patrick's Day, and I thought that when you're talking about luck, that would be particularly interesting and appropriate. So they said I was lucky that I'd already been medicated when I had the heart attack. Then I said, what about the fact that I wasn't driving myself to the hospital? They told me I was lucky about that too, because it was under their care in the ambulance when I had the heart attack. Otherwise, I'd have likely crashed and hurt someone else, and I wouldn't have been able to phone 911. So once again, the paramedics told me I was lucky. Later that evening, the staff at the Queensway Carleton Hospital confirmed that I had suffered a heart attack and that I would be a guest until I had undergone an angiogram scheduled for Friday, March 11th at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. During the angiogram, the specialist pointed out the blocked arteries on the monitor, and as I looked, he explained that I had 5 blocked arteries, ranging from 70% obstruction to 90%. Part of me was relieved that he had identified the cause of my heart attack, but I didn't fully appreciate the gravity of the miracle that I was alive until the doctor told me that the heart only has 5 major arteries supplying it with blood. So all 5 of them were blocked. And he said, "You sure are lucky," adding, "You shouldn't be alive." The doctor informed me that I was a top priority and that I should be carted away from the angiogram to the operating table. But when I had arrived at the Queenston Carleton Hospital, I had been given blood thinners in addition to the aspirin, the nitro, and the morphine. So they couldn't operate right away until my body had gotten rid of the blood thinners. So time was needed, and it was estimated that sometime around St. Patrick's Day on Thursday, March 17, at the earliest, almost a week later, would I be able to be operated on. In the meantime, I was described as a walking time bomb. Everything had to be controlled, monitored, or medicated. And while I stayed at the Queenston Carleton Hospital waiting for my body to expel the blood thinners from my system, it was painful. It was a situation where every day, every hour, everyone could see I was dying. Having lost all control over my life during this preoperative fog, I decided to turn to prayer. I also sent an email to several key people and influencers within the Knights of Columbus in Ontario, explaining to them what had just happened to me and to keep me in their prayers. The letter was sent out on Sunday, March 13th, but dated March 14th, 2022. And almost immediately, Zoe and I received dozens of expressions of get well prayers and for successful surgery and a speedy recovery. Among them was the Most Reverend Patriarchal Vicar Emeritus of Jerusalem, the Archbishop Joseph Jules Zare. And Hikmat was instrumental in that, and for that I thank you again, Hikmat, for your help. The same weekend while I was dying, I went to another patient in the room who was suffering more than me, believe it or not, and I asked him if he wanted to pray, and that it may or not help him. I told him I've never done this before. I did not know if I was doing it right, to either cure him or make him feel worse. And as he looked at me with a man hungry for hope, he said, yes. I took out my rosary and we prayed. It wasn't perfect, but it was one of those moments when I may not have been able to put my prayer in all the right words, but God hears our heart reaching out to him because it was sincere. They say that faith does not die in the operating room. Faith dies in the waiting room. It would have been easy for both of us to wash our hands of Christ. My roommate was terribly sick, seemed to be getting worse. I was literally dying while waiting for my heart surgery. I did not need to look at myself in the mirror. I could see it in the eyes of everyone who looked at me, knew and saw me failing in health. Yet here we were, both in our agony in the garden moment, praying because we still loved our God. Following a weekend of prayer on Monday, March 14th, Zoe and I were informed that I would be moved from the Queensway Carleton Hospital to the OHI, the Ottawa Health Institute. And the date of my surgery had been moved up to Wednesday. a day earlier. Tuesday morning, I woke up very hungry and I asked the nurse if I could have a piece of toast with peanut butter. And she said she'd be happy to do so after she completed her rounds. As I was waiting for my toast, my new head surgeon, Dr. David Glenner, came into my room to say that there was an opening this afternoon at 2:20, provided I had not eaten anything that morning. As fate would have it, the nurse who had promised me some toast with the peanut butter had not returned before Dr. Glenner had told me the good news. When she did return to my room, I told her my surgery had been advanced this afternoon, and she told me, "You are lucky, Jaden." Upon entering the operating room, I was surrounded by doctors and nurses who were preparing for my surgery. These people held the fate of my future in their hands. I decided to stand up next to the operating table, and I asked Dr. Glenner if I could say a few words to his team. He smiled and agreed. He gathered his team around me, and I explained that my Catholic faith is important to me, and that following prayers on the weekend by my brother Knights of Columbus and the Vicar Emeritus of Jerusalem, that everything seemed to have changed. I switched hospitals. They changed the date of my surgery 3 times, and it left me with the belief that the good Lord wanted Dr. Glenner and his team to work on me, and I thanked them in advance. This belief provided me with a certain level of comfort as I prepared to give up total control of my situation and my life to these strangers. The surgery lasted 4.5 hours, and the next morning, Dr. Glenner told me it was a textbook success, except for a couple of things. First, Dr. Glenner is a specialist using arteries instead of veins for coronary bypass surgery. The difference is that veins usually have a much shorter lifespan. And in contrast, arteries have improved long-term survival, and given my relatively young age, I know it sounds ancient to you, but I was 59, using arteries is preferred. He also told me he had originally planned to do a triple coronary artery bypass, but found another artery blocked while he was doing the surgery, so he ended up doing a quadruple bypass. Then he made the most astonishing statement of all. He told me, after he had examined me physically by opening up my chest and looking at what was inside, that there was no heart damage. I remember looking at him in disbelief, and when he saw my reaction, he said he could not explain why. I told him we both knew my condition had worsened during the last 5 days before the surgery. The troponin levels, which is a protein released in the bloodstream following a heart attack, indicated heart damage. And those levels were increasing every day exponentially. All he could say is that he physically saw my heart during the surgery and saw no acute myocardial infarction, heart damage. Before he left, he used the same scientific statement everyone else at the hospital had used since. You are lucky. By Wednesday afternoon, I was transferred from the ICU to the recovery ward at the Ottawa Heart Institute. Thursday morning, March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, was not a good day for me. I had failed to manage my pain levels properly, which caused me to breathe incorrectly, which in turn led to complications compounded by a complete lack of appetite. Feelings of being helpless began to overwhelm. I could no longer walk without losing my breath, and within hours I was given an oxygen tube which proved insufficient, so I was given an oxygen mask to wear all time. The dry air from the mask made my nose bleed, and since I was on blood thinners, the bleeding wouldn't stop. I felt and looked like a mess. All 3 surgeons came to see me later that Thursday morning and told me all the work they had done had worked perfectly. They agreed that some change in my medication told me to breathe deeper and slower. I agreed to try, but I also felt the need to see a priest and make a humble and sincere confession. If this sounds normal or obvious to many traditional Catholics, let me say that I had not been to confession since elementary school, so that was about 50 some odd years. Yet here I was, feeling a need for confession. At the same afternoon, St. Patrick's Day afternoon, Father Kipling Cooper came to see me. I explained my situation, he listened, I asked for confession, which we did following a prayer, and Father Cooper asked why I had waited so long before confessing. And maybe it was because I was afraid to put myself under the microscope because there were things that I was not particularly proud of in my past. Sometimes our first reaction is to hide these things, and in the process, we fail to become the real person we are. Later that evening, I ate a small Jell-O cup and it was the first time I had eaten anything since 5 p.m. on Monday. Later that evening, an orderly helped me get into bed around 9 p.m. for the night. Wearing my oxygen mask, I laid awake, unable to sleep, afraid that I would not wake up again. The only sound to comfort me was that of the flow of oxygen through my mask, sort of a Darth Vader kind of thing, and the alarm going off intermittently in the hallway from patients in other rooms who were asking the nurses for help. Then around 10 p.m., I lost track of the noise and was overcome by a sensation of freezing cold starting from my feet, traveling up my body slowly until my whole body was shivering. I felt like some invisible hands were pushing on my shoulders, causing me to bounce in the bed. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't stop it. And I couldn't deny it. And as you imagine, since it was my first quadruple bypass surgery, I had no reference point, no previous experience to guide me. It was the complete unknown. This fear forced me into the arms of God because I had nowhere else to go. So I had a choice to make. I could leave this world, go to sleep, leave this world, or I could ask for God's help. As terrified as I was, I stopped fighting and I cried out to God in my head, "What now? What else can happen to me now? What do you want me to do?" I feared letting go because I'm only human, and surely if I let go, I will fall. But that is why God is there. In my mind, I surrendered. I felt like I was falling. The earth dropped from beneath my feet. It was only in my mind because I knew I was in my bed. It was like falling from the 12th floor balcony of a building. And in that very moment that I let go and trusted God's decision, the concept of time had lost all meaning. So I don't know how long I was spiritually falling, but at some point I suddenly stopped falling. And for those who are familiar with the Bethel music, there's a song called "Back to Life," and it seems so real for me. There's a verse that goes something like, "The enemy thought he had me, but Jesus said, 'You are mine.'" Again, for a moment, I was neither falling nor was I being pulled up. I pictured myself underwater trying to reach the surface, and suddenly I realized I would never make it. I stopped trying. I just lay there floating, neither up or down, just suspended underwater, knowing I would eventually drown, but it was no longer up to me. I could not get to the surface alone. You know, I've given God a million reasons not to love me. But nothing seemed to have changed his mind. Because in that moment of surrender, when I was both falling and then floating underwater, when I would eventually drown spiritually, my mind came back to reality and I was overcome by a feeling of warmth starting from my toes and coming up my entire body until it reached my head and my teeth stopped chattering, and I was overcome by a feeling of warmth and peace, and my body stopped shivering, and soon thereafter I fell asleep. The next morning my transformation was complete. I had gone from feelings of despair to one of glorious hope in less than 8 hours. It began the second act of my life. The next morning, Friday, March 18, 2022, I was able to get myself out of bed, ate breakfast on my own, and my breathing was returning to normal, and by noon I no longer even needed an oxygen mask, nor the oxygen tube. I will always remember the look of Dr. Glinner's face as he walked into the hospital room later that morning and saw me rise from my chair and greet him with a smile. When he saw me standing there with a smile, he stopped in his tracks and looked at the chart again to make sure he had the right person. He looked both baffled and relieved at the same time, and I knew then that science had once again come up short, and that the gift of faith had once again prevailed. I told him I thought it was a miracle, and he just smiled and looked at my chart once again, unwilling to either deny or corroborate my claim. One thing is for certain, he could not explain my sudden, speedy recovery. Sunday morning, March 20th, 22, 11 days since my heart attack and 5 days since my heart surgery, I had recovered so well and so fast that the medical staff agreed I could leave later that same day. In fact, it was a day earlier than anticipated. I still find time to look back and see all the times the outcome could have been different and turned for the worse. I could have tried to sleep off the heart attack. I could have driven myself to the hospital and had the heart attack while driving. I could have suffered heart damage. My recovery could have failed on that fateful St. Patrick's night, and the list goes on. But the point I want to make here is that story is not about the paramedics. It's not about the nurses, and it's not about the doctors, and it's not about luck. The real story is not about the big thing. It's about the 5-second moment of faith. It was at that moment I went from the science guy, saved by the scalpel, enjoy life, to the faith guy who admitted that science could not explain what had happened to me. And that's where, Tom, you get the best card of all. What does this all mean? Trying to understand the implication was like watching the rippling effect in water when you drop a stone in it. Science was everywhere, but faith was there where it mattered most. My life, the second act of this life. When I found myself alone and physically unable to move, I was stripped from the rational world and entered God's world, the world of faith. And in that moment, when I surrendered to Him, I found my way again. And I am alive here today to talk about it. He heard my confession and the prayers of my adoring wife, my family, and my brother knights. But He also needed me to surrender to Him openly, sincerely, and ask Him into my life unconditionally. I wanted to share this story because I feel that I was given a life-changing opportunity to revive my faith and better serve the Knights of Columbus. Napoleon Hill, in his book Think and Grow Rich, says as much when he states the turning point in the lives of those who succeed usually comes at the moment of some crisis through which they are introduced to their other selves. My other self was the faith guy who took over from the science guy. My journey from baptism to science to faith is actually more common than you think, because every time I tell my story, 2 or 3 people usually come to me afterwards and talk about their journey of faith. I know there are still people who cannot accept what I have just said, my story. Why me? What makes me so special? And that is the beauty of my story, which Father Michel talked about earlier at Mass. I'm not a politician. I'm not a millionaire, Nobel Prize winner. I'm just an ordinary person, just like you. We're all God's children, and we're all eligible to be saved. Just like I was. Miracles are happening all around us, and they happen every day. God can be a player in your lives too, so don't fall to peer pressure or other people that will try to convince you that God should be nothing more than a hobby. And maybe, just maybe, my small little miracle may help you validate your own stories. As Pope Benedict XVI said, anyone who has discovered Christ must lead others to Him. A great joy cannot be kept to oneself. It has to be passed on. So let me conclude by trying something different to help you remember this evening. I want to say luck, and then I want to hear you say faith. So when I say luck, you say. When I say luck, louder, luck. There we go. Faith won this one. Gentlemen, please turn. This is the moral of my story. And I want to thank my helpers. I love you all. Esto Dignus.